We're talking about a secular age. Here it is. Here's our title slide. And what it means to live in a world that we didn't choose, in a world that just has kind of happened to us. And so go back and rewatch that thing. We're also putting these things up on the blog, by the way, little sermon summaries, so you don't have to go back and watch the whole thing. It's kind of like, what are the highlights? We just write them out. You can read them in like 30 seconds or a minute and kind of be up to speed with what's going on. Because sometimes, last summer we had like 75 sermons on the Sabbath. And if you started halfway through, or came towards the end, it's like, what did we build so far? I don't even know. So you can go back on the blog starting last Sabbath. You can get on the blog each week and kind of get a recap of what's going on. You can get yourself up to speed, all right? Unless you want to listen to hours and hours and hours of sermons, that, of course, is up to you. But we're talking about secular age and what it means to live in this world we live in now. And today we're going to talk about subtraction stories, the stories that we tell. And I want to approach this actually from Judges chapter 3, because there was a guy named Ehud. And Ehud was on a top secret mission to liberate the Israelites from the Moabite king. Now, I'm not going to get into the gory details of this story because they are, in fact, gory. But here's what's really interesting. Okay, so Ehud wants to go visit the Moabite king. As I imagine many vassals did, the Moabite king was over everybody. So, I got something to tell you. Or maybe he came to pay tribute or whatever it may be. He came to visit this Moabite king. And the Moabite TSA was patting Ehud down at the door. Okay? Let me just check here, make sure you're not armed with anything. Didn't find anything. No weapons. Okay? Ehud goes and meets with the Moabite king, says, I got a secret to tell you. The king says, ooh, secrets, and kicks all his guards out of the room. And Ehud stabs the king and kills him, and Israel is freed from the Moabites. And the question is, how did the mighty Moabite TSA fail to find the weapon that Ehud was hiding? And the text is pretty clear. It says that Ehud was a left-handed person. And so it said he strapped this sword. It was a cubit long, about 18 inches. You want to call that a sword? Fine. Really, a long dagger or a short sword. So it said he strapped it onto his right thigh. I'm going to guess the inside, wasn't wearing it openly, right? He was trying to conceal it. So he strapped it into the inside of his right thigh. And apparently they didn't think to search his right leg because they assumed everybody is right-handed, right? So these left-handed people are not dangerous. We don't have to worry about them. We only got to worry about the right-handed people out there. Is anybody left-handed here, just out of curiosity? Are we all right-handed? Are we all righties? All right. Fair enough. So why did they fail? They didn't protect their king. They may have lost their own lives as a result of failing to protect their king because they told themselves a story. In fact, they're not the only people in the Bible who tells themselves a story that left-handed people are weird, that you don't have to worry about left-handed people, that left-handed people aren't dangerous. This is a story that they're believing. And because they believe this story, they fail to adequately screen Ehud as he came into the king's palace to check him for weapons because they didn't think left-handed people, apparently, were very dangerous. And so all of this is to illustrate for our purposes that the stories we tell can be dangerous. That we have to be careful of the stories we tell about the world and the stories we tell about ourselves. Stories are powerful. If somebody's going through a divorce, maybe they weren't working and now they got to go back to school to get a degree so they can get a good job and provide for their family. Like they start telling themselves a different story about the world than maybe they did when 10 years ago. When I left the Catholic Church as a teenager, I began telling different stories about myself and the world. A different story than I was raised with. Right? Whenever we enter moments of transition in our lives, it begins by us learning to tell different stories. Different stories. Sometimes as maybe we had a rough childhood, we learn to say, you know what, I am valuable. I am not going to be defined by something that happened to me when I was younger. Right? What are we doing in that moment? We're telling different stories about ourselves and the world that we live in. Stories are powerful. So we're hearing new stories in the secular age as well. One might expect, when you make a transition from a quote-unquote Christian age, from Christendom to a secular age, then we're going to be telling new stories about origins, new stories about what is meaningful, new stories about our destiny as well as human beings. Where are we headed? And new stories about what the good life is. What is it that we're all trying to chase? All right? Now, too often, these stories are what Charles Taylor, the philosopher that we've been journeying with, calls subtraction stories. Subtraction stories. And James K.A. Smith, who we've also been hanging out with in this journey, he puts it like this. What's a subtraction story? He says, once upon a time, this is a subtraction story. You've heard these stories. You've heard people say something like this. Once upon a time, as these subtraction stories rehearse it, we believed in sprites and fairies and gods and demons, but as we became rational, the world became, we'll say, progressively disenchanted. Religion and belief withered with scientific exorcism of superstition, right? So this is a story you hear people telling these days. This is a subtraction story that once upon a time, we were all religious. We believed in God and gods. We believed that the woods were haunted. We believed that, there was the beings in space that were watching over us. We call them angels or whatever, right? But now that we have science, now that we have greater wisdom, we're thinking more than we used to. Now we don't have to believe in those stories anymore, right? So what are they saying? Why do we call them subtraction stories? Because it basically says just subtract God from it, and it's a perfectly rational story of our existence. Just subtract God from it. And that's what they're doing in that as that goes. Like, just get rid of the fairies and sprites and the divine and the magical and the miracles and all that kind of stuff. And then you're left with is reality. And this is the story that is being told. You see it in many, many places. You hear it in many, many places in one form or another. It's also a framing story, a story by which we use to make other stories make sense. So framing stories are as old as time. Eve in the garden with the serpent. The serpent basically asks her, did God say this? And so she repeats what God said. And in Eve's retelling of it, God is the creator. God is somebody who's looking after his creation and doesn't want them to die because he loves his creation. So God tells his creation, don't eat from this tree or else you're going to die. And because I don't want that to happen, I'm telling you in advance, okay? That's the kind of frame behind Eve's worldview at this point. What does the serpent say? Oh, actually, you're not really going to die. What's happened is God is not this wise and loving parent who wants to watch out for you. God is actually jealous and petty, and he doesn't want you to eat this fruit and become like him, knowing what he knows, good and evil, right? So God is actually, he's not a nice parent who's looking out for you. God is a petty tyrant who's trying to keep all the power for himself, and he doesn't want to share anything with you. What is that? That is a story that is meant to make sense of everything else. It's a framing story. If you believe that story, you're going to look at this tree differently than if you believe the story that Eve was telling, right? The significance of that tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden is going to depend based on what kind of frame or lens you are seeing it with. If you believe that God is loving, then that command not to eat of the tree makes perfect sense. He wants to protect us. If you believe that God is a petty tyrant, then that command not to eat of the tree is something that I don't have to follow because it's just another example of God trying to hold us all back. These are framing stories. They frame the world for us, and everything that happens in the world kind of gets interpreted into this frame. It's like putting the border of a puzzle. You get that part done right. Every other piece has to fit within that puzzle. Okay? The Great Controversy is another framing story. When you understand the Great Controversy, how there was a war in heaven way back when, and Lucifer was jealous of the throne of God, wanted his spot, and you trace that arc of that story all the way to the end and the final defeat of evil. That Great Controversy story is a framing story by which all of our other stories are made to fit. Okay, that's a framing story that we use as believers. All right? But the two framing stories that we have in the Garden of Eden cannot both be true. Only one can be true. Either the serpent's framing story was correct or Eve's original framing story was correct. And so what we often have is a competition to see which framing story today, the one that's told by Christians or the one that's told by non-Christians, best explains the world that we live in. Best explains the world. And so you see this kind of a competition. So you'll find Christians online or elsewhere. There's kind of some jostling going on between believers and non-believers over whose view of reality, whose framing story best frames reality, best accounts for all the intricacies, right? So a problem that Christians have to deal with is why is there evil in the world if God is good? That's not so much a problem if you believe that everything just kind of evolved by chance. You're going to expect chaos. You're going to expect destruction. You're going to expect death and all these things, right? That's not as much of a problem for them. But maybe non-believers have to wrestle with other things like, why is this one person who went to the hospital with an incurable disease suddenly going home? Or why does this miracle seem to have taken place? Or why does this person really think that God is speaking to them and told them to go do something? How do you explain that from their framing story? But there's some jostling going on in the culture of adjusting our framing stories to try to meet more of the facts, because whoever can explain more of the facts, more of reality, has a more powerful story, and therefore they are probably correct. So Christians will use things like 2 Timothy 4 verse 3 against the idea of a secular subtraction story. They'll say like, for the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Therefore, all these non-believers out there, this verse applies to them. This is why they're trying to set up this framing story. They can't handle the truth anymore. So therefore, they're trying to come up with all this stuff about, there is no God, there's no miracles, there's no supernaturalism in the universe, da-da-da-da-da. So this is how Christians will say, what are they trying to do when they throw this verse out there? They're trying to say, your framing story is actually just a small piece of, just a puzzle piece in my framing story. You're coming up with this stuff because you just don't want to believe in God, all right? Now, non-Christians will do the same thing. They'll say, hey, look at this thing from this totally reputable medical news today, where it says religion is like sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the sense that it activates the same parts of your brain. So you guys only go to church and believe what you believe because it kind of gives you that same reward that you would get from gambling or you would get from other things as well, right? So what are they trying to do? They're trying to say your entire religious belief is just a small little puzzle piece in our framing story, right? So we're trying to out-explain each other and whose views can account for more of reality, right? And that's kind of what goes on, And so we're trying to explain each other's stories. But I'm going to come at this in a little bit of a different way and just start by saying this. I was going to make a bunch of points, but I think we'll confine ourselves to one point today. And that is this. Subtraction stories, secular subtraction stories just don't work. Because we never just delete God from our lives. We always replace God with something else. So it's not just, if you just get rid of God, then you're an authentic, rational human being, not believing in that hocus pocus stuff. But it's never quite that simple, because nobody ever just gets rid of God. They always add something. I want you to take Richard Rorty. He was a philosopher, very brilliant. He went to the University of Chicago at 14, if that tells you anything, and passed away a few years ago. Anyways, this is what he says. All right, he's critiquing religion. He's coming at this from this subtraction story. He says, as social justice increases, we hope that there will be less temptation for the poor to murder the rich, and consequently less need for religion as a device for diminishing social unrest. Right? Religion is the opium of the masses. And less temptation to hope for pie in the sky. So the only role left for religious belief will be to help individuals find meaning in their lives and to serve as a help to individuals in their times of need. So, right, we're being generous here. If we could just get rid of God, then we would get more social justice. Right? This is how he's seeing it. As social justice increases, he makes the case in this paper that social justice is increasing because religion is getting out of the way increasingly. And so we're getting some things done. But this is his point. If we just get rid of God, if we can just subtract God from our human calculus, from the stories that we tell, then we can have more justice. And religion's still going to hang around, but it's just kind of like to help your neighbor whenever you need to help your neighbor. But the world will be a much better place if we can just subtract God from the stories that people tell. All right. But as Charles Taylor says, that I am left, once I've subtract God, that I am left with only human concerns doesn't tell me to take universal human welfare as my goal, nor does it tell me that freedom is important or fulfillment or equality. He's basically saying, okay, I get rid of God out of my story, but then why should I care about social justice? Why should I care about other human beings? Why should I care about what happens on the other side of the world? What's the rationale at this point? All right, we're going to get into this. But, it was Tertullian who wrote Early Church Father. He says, it is only just and a privilege inherent in human nature that every person should be able to worship according to his own convictions. You guys realize this is the first few centuries. This is not 1776. This is not some French philosopher in the Enlightenment. This is in the first few centuries where Tertullian says this. He says, for one person's religion neither harms nor hurts another. He's making a case for pluralism in the Roman Empire. Therefore, coercion has no place in religious devotion. Religious liberty and pluralism, I would argue, didn't come to the Western world from the Greeks or from the Romans or from Gandhi. It came from Christians. It came from Christians. It is a Christian value, even if it is one I will be happy to admit that we have, not happy to admit, sad to admit that we have failed at a number of times throughout our own history, okay? But that idea did not come from the Romans. It did not come from any other people. It came from Christians. So if we have religious liberty today, if we have a pluralistic society where we say we're not going to legislate religion and choose one that we like and get rid of the rest, like that we all have space here. America's a big place. Europe is a big place. Australia's a big place, right? Wherever else we have pluralistic societies, it's big enough where you can go worship over there and I can go worship over here and we don't have to get into each other's way. That's a Christian idea. So I guess I'm curious to pose the question to Richard Rorty is why he thinks justice will increase if we subtract God from the story. Because it seems that, at least in this sense, it arrived because God was in the story. So let's not act like if we get rid of God, then we're left with wonderful religious liberty. It's only because people believed in God that we have religious liberty. Now, I want to bring in an op-ed from Jerry Coyne. Wrote this in USA Today. This is what he claims. Secular morality is what pushes religion to improve its own dogma on issues such as slavery and the treatment of women. Right? He's basically saying, yeah, Christians have been around for a while, but it's really the atheists, it's really the agnostics who are pushing religion to do better. And look, is there a little bit of truth to that? Sure. Like we're going to get pushed by the culture to do better in some areas that we have been slow to do well in. That is absolutely true. But is it true in a larger sense? No. By the way, this is a subtraction story again, right? Like it's only when you remove God that secular people are able to have their superior moral conditions or that they can push upon other religious people, right? So get rid of God and you can be more moral is essentially the germ of what he's saying here. But as Matt Rossano says, especially regarding slavery, he says, pagan authors in the ancient world occasionally condemned slavery, but they sorely lacked any compelling rationale for why slavery itself, rather than the maltreatment of slaves, was evil. What he's saying is, yeah, of course you'll find pagan thinkers in the ancient world who condemn slavery, but mostly they condemned the maltreatment or mistreatment of slaves, not the institution of slavery itself, which they largely said is perfectly fine. It was only Christians who said, actually, this isn't going to work as an institution. Whether you treat them well or not, it's not a good situation. Right? And so he's saying, like, if you look back in the ancient world, Matt Rossano is saying, like, you don't see a detailed rationale of why slavery is bad. Like, what are you going to argue it on the grounds of, if not that every human being is created in the image of God and stand equal before Him? Like, that's the Christian rationale of why slavery should be abolished. What else do you got? It's bad for the economy? Right? I mean, where does this idea of this concern for humanity come from? All right, you remember, man, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. And what are these truths? That all men, well, women, you all are in that too, are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But with respect to Thomas Jefferson, in what way are these truths self-evident? Because the Greeks, they weren't self-evident to the Greeks. They weren't self-evident to the Han Chinese. They're not self-evident to, pick. They were not self-evident. They weren't. Did you get these truths by gazing up into the sky? Did you get these truths by reading Confucius? Or perhaps Jefferson and others were more influenced by their Christian milieu than they perhaps care to admit, right? Now, don't take my word for it. There's an Israeli author who wrote this book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, that would agree. He says the Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul and that all souls are equal before God. However, he says, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal? So he decided from his perspective, I think he's a biologist, he would rewrite what Jefferson wrote to be more scientifically accurate, and this is what he comes up with. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men evolve differently, that they are born with certain immutable characteristics, and that among these are life and the pursuit of pleasure. You notice what word isn't in there at the end is liberty. So he said that's a political ideal. It's not inherent to your biology. I don't know if I would join a revolution under this slogan. Right, but he's saying if you really want to just get down to it, it's like in terms of what you can demonstrate as self-evident from biology. Yeah, of course, we all evolve differently. We all have different characteristics, and that we have an instinct to live towards life, and that we want to all have a comfortable, good life. It's like that. You can demonstrate that all creatures want. But to get all that other stuff that Thomas Jefferson talked about, you have to have these Christian presuppositions, right? So it's not just me saying this as a Christian. I'm not the only one. The stories we tell matter. The stories that are being told today in society, if they had been told 500 years ago, would not have resulted in the society that we have today. The rationale, the reason why we have human rights is because of this fundamental conviction that all human beings are created in the image of God. And not only that, but that all human beings have to one day give account to God for how they treated each other. This is why I should care about what's happening on the other side of the world, because I am my brother's keeper. Because I am my brother's keeper. That's why I should care. Otherwise, it does not affect me at all. I can go to the store like any other day, go get bread and butter and my Impossible burgers. And whatever civil war is going on somewhere else, whatever genocide is going on somewhere else, does not concern me in the least. Does not impact the quality of my life. It does not bother me, in terms of how I go about my business one way or the other. Why then the concern? It doesn't come from the subtraction stories. It comes from the stories that Christians have been telling for a long time. Now again, I recognize how frequently Christians have failed to live up to their own stories, okay? I get that, all right? I'm not acting like Christians have been perfect for 2,000 years, right? If we had lived up to our stories, I don't think we would be living in a secular age right now. If you want to point out the hypocrisy of Christians throughout the centuries, I'll join you. I mean, it's there. I got no argument there. But the stories, in terms of whether they can adequately explain the reality that we all experience, I think they do. They explain it better. Because subtraction stories, they don't work. Because you never just subtract God out of your life. You always add something to it. And the point that Charles Taylor wants to make with subtraction stories is they add exclusive humanism. They take away God, but they add exclusive humanism. That is, we humans can decide meaning. We humans can decide our destiny. We humans can come together and confer about our origins and these sort of things and sort things out on our own. And we can decide what the good life looks like and so on and so forth. In other words, we've taken the role that God once formerly occupied, right? God decided our origins. He told us where we came from. He created us. He tells us where we're going. He tells us right and wrong. He tells us what is meaningful and good. Right? Those are the things, that's the territory formula occupied in our lives by God. You're going to remove God from that. You've got to put something in that space. You've got to put something in that space. So it's not really a subtraction story. All of these stories are really about addition. They're about addition. So whenever people want to tell these stories, I think the question that's worth asking them is, okay, what are you replacing God with then? What are you replacing God with? The issue isn't fundamentally whether Christians have done terrible things in history. Of course they have, just like all peoples have. Shouldn't have happened. But of course they have. All right, I get you got a beef with Christians in Christian history. All right, you don't want to follow God anymore. All right. What are you going to replace them with? What's better? Because it's easy to tear it down. We can tear it down. We can poke holes. We can highlight problems. I get it. But what are you going to be building that's better? What story, with thinking that if we get rid of God, we'll have better social justice and better human. Okay, what story are you going to start telling that will lead to more justice? That's better than all human beings are created in the image of God. Like, what's going to lead to this outcome that you want to see society shift to? I'm dying to know, because so often it's just, let me tear down the Christian view of things. But like, what are you replacing it with? Like, what's better? Show me what you're building. Put a little model on the desk. Let's walk around it. Let's see it. Is it better? Because very often we're riding on the coattails of the age that came before. We assume human rights. We assume, whoever told you these things were good? Christians did. I was going to say, well, Matt, you're not the only one who can get in trouble today, all right? I'll see you in the penalty box. Oh, man. So, sometimes the stories we tell are just about inventing reality just as much as they are describing reality. And we see this oftentimes, even in the Bible. In Hosea, which is my favorite book in the Bible, chapter 2, it's in the Minor Prophets. If you're like me, it doesn't matter how many times you read the Bible, you're like, what book is it after again? This one's actually an easy one. Hosea is one of the easier ones. All right. You know where Daniel is? All right. You go to Daniel, you take a right. It's right next to the gas station that used to be there 30 years ago. Oh, man, I hate when people give me directions like that. All right. It's just right after Daniel, guys. In Hosea chapter 2, we'll put it up on the screen for those who don't have the Bible. But this was Israel being oppressed, going through difficulty, and as a result, they began telling a new story. This is God speaking to Hosea. It says in verse 5 there, she said, that is, Israel said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water and my wool and my linen and my olive oil and my drink. And then God says, she, meaning Israel, has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. What is Israel doing here? They go through some difficulty and they say, all these blessings I have, I got these from these other gods. What are they doing? They're telling a new story, right? They live in the same world, but now they're like, what? God didn't give me these things, not Yahweh, not that God. I got these from these other gods, and I'm going to give thanks for all of these blessings I have by going to Baal and offering them sacrifices to Baal. And God's like, I'm the one who gave those to you. Me. I'm the one who blessed you. Why are you going and thanking Baal for the wonderful gifts that you've received? I'm the one that blessed you. And this is why I bring this text up, because the stories we tell are important, and they're fundamentally about justice. Because when Israel went and thanked Baal for all the blessings that Yahweh had given them, that was unjust. The story that they were telling was unjust. It was wrong. It didn't recognize reality. It didn't recognize that it was God who had been blessing them. It's unjust to give credit to Baal for what God has done. So I don't buy the idea that these secular stories are neutral or even natural or even entirely realistic. I believe that they have some good critiques of the church that we need to listen to sometimes, and use to shape up. Not all criticism is wrong. We can do better. We can do better. But sometimes it gets taken to this length where the story is told where Christianity has done nothing good in the world, that it has persecuted and been morally incompetent, and it started all these wars, and it started all of the colonialism and all these sort of things, and there's nothing to be grateful for. And I guess if you're watching and you're telling these secular subtraction stories, I just want to say I think there's much to be grateful for. I think there's much good in Christianity that's being overlooked. And in telling the stories this way, it ends up being stories of injustice, of not giving credit where credit is due, and not realizing that much of what you have today was built for you by people you now vilify. And while there is much to be ashamed of in Christian history, there's also much to be thankful of. And what we have today is because of that, because of these folks. So, I don't think it's they're natural or neutral even, or always realistic. These secular subtraction stories come with their own values and principles and visions of the good life, just like every other religion. They have to answer those questions. But these stories are part of the everyday part of our secular age. They are the lens through which so many people today see the world. They claim for themselves the legacy of human rights and political freedom and tolerance, but these were all Christian contributions to Western society. I'm not saying Christians are the only people in human history that ever had a good idea, but I'm saying the experience that we have in the West, they arrived. The conduit was Christianity. That's how it got here. And to pretend otherwise results in an unjust story. So first and foremost, I think we must seek to tell a story that meets the reality that we face. And for that, I personally would recommend The Great Controversy as a framing story for understanding the world and why bad things happen and good things happen and what is good and what is bad. But this sermon, I will say, is not just about making Christians feel better, because the reason we have these other stories, as I said, is because we have so spectacularly failed to live up to the one that we've been telling. And that's why I believe the story you live is far more important than the story you tell. You can tell a story about a loving God who will return for us and all of that all day long, but if you don't live as if that's true, then your story is also a lie. We have to live as if it's true. And if Christians would have done that, this would be a very different world today, I think. If we would have been kind, and we would have turned the other cheek, and we would have loved our neighbor and taken responsibility for him or her, and all of these things that Jesus told us to do, if we would have honored him and listened to God and did what he asked us to do, I think this would have been a different story that we are living. So the story that we live as people in 2022 is far more important than the story we tell other people that we believe. So I'll leave you with the question. What story are you living? I'm not asking what story you're telling other people. What story are you living? And maybe you need to have a conversation with somebody who's around you to ask that question too, because sometimes it's hard to see for ourselves. You know, it is exceptionally hard, and I'm not immune to this either. You know, we talk about having peace that passes understanding and being patient and stuff. I'm impatient all the dang time. Like, my wife obviously makes humility easy on me, and you know, I am. Like, I have a hard time. I lose my patience all the time, and it's like, I don't want to be that person. I can tell everybody, oh, God makes us so much more patient. He gives us peace, but I'm losing my patience all the time. Like, you know, I may believe that here, but I'm not living as if that story is true. You know, so that means I need to make an effort here to do better with this kind of stuff. And to live as if what I'm saying is real. And if it's, you know, if I'm not willing to live up to the story I'm telling, then I need to tell a different story. So are you living up to the story that you're telling? That's our challenge as Christians. And whatever, it's hard to say which way this is going to go. You know, if the secular subtraction stories at some point are going to shift into something else or whatever may happen. I think the future, if we're going to have any influence on it, we have to live up to these stories. It's not enough just to kind of fight in the pages of Facebook. It's not enough to argue on TV with somebody. It's not enough to debate somebody, although sometimes those debates are interesting. Like, we just have to live up to it. If we want to steer the way that our future is going here in the West, we just have to live up to it. And instead of arguing about what is right and wrong, I mean, there is a place for that, but fundamentally, we just need to live up to it and be the kind of people we've always said we are. And for that, we need Jesus. It's not enough for me to want to be patient. It's not enough for me to read a book about patience. It's not enough for me to just force myself to be patient, because I can smile on the outside, right, but just be all torn up in the inside. Like, I need Jesus every day in my life. I need His Spirit on me to remind me, Matthew, be patient. You know, you need it too, all right? You need it too. We all need it. And to live up to the things that we profess to believe. That's my challenge for us. And I think there's enough to go around here that secular folks have a challenge with the stories they're telling. Christians have a challenge this morning from the stories they're living. We'll leave it at that. All right, let's pray. Father God, I just want to thank you because you are good and gracious to us. It's hard, Lord, to glimpse at any century, any decade, where there hasn't been a Christian somewhere who hasn't made a colossal screw-up of what they profess to believe. Sometimes, Lord, I wonder if we have, if we've just messed up more than we've ever gotten it right. That may be. But, you know, in an age, Lord, where people are being deleted for messing up, canceled for messing up, we have a long tradition as Christians of repentance, of forgiveness, that there's always a way back. That there's always a way back if only we will realize our wrong and humble ourselves and turn to you. And Lord, the world desperately needs that message right now. Because there's a lot of people out there who, you know, maybe they've done some dumb things or said some dumb things, but they're just done. There's no repentance. There's no option for forgiveness. There's no option for reconciliation. You're just excommunicated from society. And it breaks the heart to see it operate that way. When we've got something better in our own hands, when we've lived something better, Lord. We just hope, Lord, that especially with this time when people are all ripped up about our political situation and COVID and all that, Lord, that we would deal gently with each other and that Christians would be models of mercy and of patience and of understanding with each other and not quick to judge and blast people and condemn them and all of these sort of things, Lord. Certainly there are some things that are right and wrong that deserve to be condemned or praised, but I just pray, Lord, this is our moment to exemplify the story that we've been professing, to be different than everybody else around us, and to be like you. And I just pray, Lord, that you would just give us those qualities that we need. And if we need to be practicing what we preach, then put us in situations, Lord. I hate praying this prayer because it's scary, but put us in situations where we need to be in order to learn the things that we need to learn. Just do with that what you will, Lord. And I pray when we get to the moment of testing that you would help us to prevail and learn patience and learn peace and learn courage and learn gentleness and learn whatever it is that we need to learn to be more like you. This is our prayer in the name of Jesus.